Howard County Code to remove the Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance exemption for conditionally exempt residential subdivision plans.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm losing my place here. I'm trying to get to something else. There's a lot of paper. Okay. I move to table Council Bill 56, 2020.
Second.
Ms. Schwartz-Jones, can you please call the vote?
Yes. Ms. Young?
All right, I move to table Council Bill 56, 2020, because there was an extensive discussion at the work session regarding rephasing, P-H-A-S-I-N-G, because just in case people are listening and wondering what we're talking about, which means actually taking the group of houses or townhomes that are planning to be built and putting them in different time periods in order to try and keep the schools in the Turf Valley area from becoming overcrowded. And I thought that those conversations should move ahead and perhaps even be completed before we take this bill off the table. So that was my reason for putting it on the table, and that is my reason for voting yes.
Okay. Dr. Jones?
No.
Ms. Rigby?
No.
Ms. Walsh?
This bill, CB 56, concerns the same developer, the same development, who is the beneficiary of the land transaction we just hastily approved 5 minutes ago. I appreciate Chair Young's willingness to table it so that Department of Planning and Zoning and the developer, as was offered in our work session, could find some way forward here that does not end up hurting exclusively the children who are districted to go to schools that the Turf Valley development feed into. As I mentioned in work session before, that includes not only District 1 children, but District 5 children, and it has effect overall on the county. My vote is yes.
Okay. And Mr. Youngman?
I'll probably talk more about this later. And I know that we're going to work on some rephasing and hope to have some conversations about that. But I don't want to base those conversations on the threat of this bill sort of hanging on the table. So as far as tabling is concerned, I'm voting no.
All right, I move to approve Council Bill 56-2020.
Second.
All right, Council Bill 56-2020 has been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Vice Chair Walsh.
With all due respect, Mr. Youngman, you wouldn't be having this conversation if CB 56 had not been filed. We heard testimony in the work session that a plan that has taken 35 years has only been built half in. And although we heard the developer complain that other developments since have come in and crowded local schools, we also learned that some of those developments crowding those same local schools originate from the same development entity. We also heard that the developer is very particular about how things look, and that itself may have contributed to some of the incredible delays enjoyed here. We learned that this development has been exempted from moderate income housing unit provision over the entirety of its 35 years. I beg to differ, and I suggest that the default here should be no more exemptions until we work out a deal that is better for the county as a whole, that is better for the families whose children go to those schools. It is not lost on me the coincidence, if that's what it is, that CB 53 to give this developer $6 million over the next 10 years, and this bill were filed in the same exact month. But I do think if we're going to go forward, we should vote in support of this bill and negotiate from a position that is much more powerful than continuing to allow this one singular developer to be exempted from all manner of land use law.
Well, I think we discussed in the work session, they're not exempt from all manner of land use law, and there's lots of subdivision requirements that they're not exempt from. I made it pretty clear in the work session, and a lot of us have had private conversations that whether it's Turf Valley, whether it's Savage, whether it's Columbia, Elk Ridge, wherever it is, I don't think government should be in the business of granting approvals to private entities, private businesses that have investors, that have lenders, that have subcontractors and other businesses that have located to the area on the basis of a certain timeline. That government should be in the business of revoking their approvals, because government has failed over 10-plus years to plan for that. I mentioned in the conversation about the school site that I think the Board of Ed has irresponsibly delayed taking action on the school site. One of the things that I continue to hear over and over of why Turf Valley was no longer Elementary School 43 was that we didn't have the land yet. Well, we could have had the land 3 years ago, so we can talk about the particulars of this particular development, but I assure you, whether it's in anybody's district, whether it's any developer, whatever the case might be, I just think that it is absolutely, I'm philosophically against taking away government approvals on which lots of people and lots of investors and entities have made investments and taken risk. So that's why I think we sit down with them. If we want to talk about them, if you want to take credit for that and attribute it to this bill, that is totally fine. But for me to have agreed to table a bill that I'm never going to support, it didn't seem sincere. So I'll let the
I
next
do
person
not-
talk.
Yeah, I do not think the testimony that we've heard in work session corroborates that story, that this is some relied upon interest that, subcontractors and all of the hardworking Americans are working towards. The testimony was 35 years ago, a plan was approved, and the developer has built in only half of what then was approved. And since this time, and in 4-year increments, the developer comes in and asks to rephase the project so that it can extend an approval that was obtained 35 years ago in 1986. A lot has changed since then. And again, most of what has changed since then has nothing to do with school capacity in the northern region, which is where those schools fit into. I again strongly urge my colleagues that this is a bill that should be voted for tonight, if that's what we're going to do, and not against. And then we can make other changes as they may be required. I know certainly I'll be looking at the MIHU, and I'll be looking at that 4-year phase-in requirement. But I would appreciate the support for this bill.
Thank you, Ms. Walsh. Are there any other comments? No? Okay. So Ms. Schwartz-Jones, can you please call the vote on Council Bill 56, 2020?
Yes. Ms. Young?
All right. I vote yes.
Dr. Jones? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I
I'd like to just say a couple words. I vote yes. I think that it is important not to allow for these types of exemptions to go on indefinitely. My preference would have been to have a phase-in over the course of maybe 3 or 4 years to take the exemption away at the end of that phase-in. I think that that's a business-friendly approach, and it also lets people know that this won't go on indefinitely. It's not unusual, and it happens in other counties and has happened in other counties where these types of phase-ins occur, where exemptions were initially created when Apfo or Apfo-like legislation went into effect in other local jurisdictions. Why this particular exemption has continued as long as it has, it's beyond me. I really don't know. And I will say that I did have a discussion with a council member today about creating a piece of legislation that would make sure that whenever we do pass legislation, at least this council does, that we have guardrails on our own legislation. That exemptions that we may create as a county council would only be created for a certain period of time and never indefinitely, as this piece of legislation was done 30 years ago. And for all of those reasons, and because I appreciate Vice Chair Walsh's continued advocacy to do anything that she can to try and keep our schools from being overcrowded, I vote yes.
Dr. Jones?
No.
Ms. Rigby?
So I really think that we should be clear that phasing is not part of this bill or even the section of code that the bill addresses. Moderate income housing units are not part of this bill or the section of code that this bill deals with. Last year, the county council significantly raised the school facility surcharge on new development in an effort to generate additional funds for school construction based off the data of what we had coming, which we knew about, which includes these units. This year, the council also raised the transfer tax with the same goal of fulfilling school construction. So the problem is really clear that our school capacity is strained and we need additional dollars to construct schools in Howard County. This legislation works directly against the school construction bills that this council passed by delaying over $10 million in school construction funds that HCPSS needs. This bill would pass the buck down another 4 years from now when a future council will be in presumably a similar position, and plans to build the Turf Valley School are potentially delayed even further. I agree that we have school capacity challenges, and this bill is not the solution. I vote no.
Okay, Ms. Walsh?
Families in and around Turf Valley, whether you're District 1 or District 5, I hope that you heard that explanation, because I now welcome you to what is and was Elkridge, which is by our own school impact fees, we pay interest on someone else's schools. This was just merely setting the level playing field, making everyone comply with the same rules. And once again, this is too big a bite. Chair Young, you mentioned a business-friendly approach. This was a school-friendly approach. This was a kid-friendly approach. This was a family-friendly approach. This was a constituent family approach. And I can't get 3 votes to support it. My vote is yes.
And Mr. Youngman?
I agree with much of what Chair Young said, that, and I think most of the bills that we've passed, to the extent that we have had any sort of grandfathering in, we've set some guardrails in that, and I think you and I talked about this today. We may have. You know, maybe our code should have something that is general, where in anything we do, if there's grandfathering and it's land use, that it kind of automatically expires after a certain time, so we don't have to worry about kind of relitigating that every time we do a bill. To set better policy going forward is, I am all on board. This is a frustrating situation. But when you talk about all those families own some of those local businesses in that village center too. Families, have jobs working on those homes too. So business predictability is something that I've testified on a million times before I was on the council. I talked about in forums and during the campaign, and consistent with that, I just think that for whatever good justifications we might have to revoke government approvals on something of this scale is just not something that government should ever be in the business doing. So I vote no.
All right, that is CB 56, and it fails.
Okay, Council Bill 57, introduced by David Youngman, co-sponsored by Deb Young.